Hello. With today's session, we are going to wrap up the colonial period for the most part. Yes, there's going to be some as we go into the Revolutionary War, but as far as the characteristics of the development of the colonies and how the North America continent gets developed by Europeans, we're going to finish up with here in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts off with the triangle trade. And with the triangle trade, you can see by this map how everything looks kind of like a triangle, depending on which direction they're going. So you can see triangles that go this direction. So it's coming from the New World to down to the Caribbean, or it's coming from the Old World and down into Africa and back over there. So you can see the triangles, and so that's why it's called the triangle trade. So it's a trade network between Europe, Africa, and the New World. One of the most important things that's going to come out of the triangle trade, of course, is going to be the slave trade that comes out of this part of West Africa. You can see the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, and they're all called that because of the major commodity that is coming out of these areas. As we look at the slave trade, I'm going to go to a different map for you so you can see a better idea. If you'll click for me, there you go. And so you can see the different amounts of slaves that are coming out of West Africa and where they're mostly going. Colonial merchants are going to profit from the slave trade. Slaves coming to North America, it's not going to grow as rapidly as you think. If you look at the map there, you can see where the majority of the slaves coming out of Africa are going to go to the Caribbean and into Central and South America. That's because in those areas they used up their workforce. They're going to start with the Native Americans and they're going to work them to death. They're going to need a new labor source. They're going to bring in African slaves and they're going to basically do the same thing to them. And so you're going to see that the vast majority of slaves are going to go into Central and South America. Only about 500,000 slaves are going to come to North America. And so it makes you wonder why the slave trade or the slavery grew to what it was in North America. Well, because slaves were so expensive and because they had a tendency to die rapidly, the plantation owners are going to do a better job of protecting their investment. Yes, slaves are going to be mistreated. Any kind of bondage is going to be horrible. It makes no difference time period. It makes no difference who the master is. Anytime that you are not free to be your own person, it is going to be horrible. But the masters in North America are going to look at their slaves as their property and as an investment. And as such, they're going to do a better job of taking care of their slaves. They are also going to encourage their slaves to have children so that they could have other slaves. So as time goes by the time we get to the Civil War, you're going to have 4 million slaves in North America that are going to come out of the 500,000 that first came over. Now, it's with this particular incidents of slave trade coming out of Africa and into the New World is when slavery is going to change from being something that the rich lorded over the poor, so anybody of any race could be a slave, to where it becomes denoted mostly by race. And so this is where you're going to have whites as masters and blacks as slaves. The slaves coming out of Africa are going to be sold into slavery by their fellow countrymen. It was quite common in Africa for warring tribes to, at the end of a war, the victor would enslave the losing tribe. And so when the Europeans show up, it became profitable for a lot of the tribes that were very good in warfare to sell their captives to the Europeans. And so that's where this all begins, way back in, in Africa, and how they get moved over to here. You also have got the trip that goes across the Atlantic. I want to show you this next graphic so you can get a picture in your head of what this looks like. This is the bottom of a ship that is coming across the Atlantic. And as you can see from the diagram, the slaves are packed in there almost like sardines. This is known as the Middle Passage. It was a horrible 3 or 4 weeks across the Atlantic. If the person next to you died, then they were left there for the rest of the voyage. You have slaves that are the men slaves are going to be put to work rowing the ship. And so it was a horrible trip across the Atlantic, and it's known as the Middle Passage. Now, slavery is going to grow faster and be more encased in the southern colonies than it's going to be in the northern colonies. Now, keep in mind, slavery was accepted and was legal throughout all 13 colonies by the 1700s. But because of the geography and the fact that they have large plantations in the South, that is why slavery is going to grow more in the South than it does in the North. They need a larger workforce to be able to cultivate the fields and make a profit off of their crops. I'm going to show you a bill of sale for slaves. These advertisements would be put up along city blocks. If you've ever had the opportunity to go to Charleston, South Carolina, you can actually go to the old slave mart and see the building where they bought and sold slaves. It is now a museum, a very interesting one, run by the African Americans in Charleston. So as slavery becomes more prominent in the southern colonies, you're going to have Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, and they're all going to become slave societies. It's going to become very much a race division between the whites and the blacks in these colonies. Even though, as time goes by, you're going to have some colonies where the slaves are going to outnumber the whites. I'm going to show you the next graphic here. This is the colonial slave population. So you can see that up in the northern states, they don't have a very large percentage of slaves. They didn't really need them. But as you get down into the southern states, you're going to see how the numbers start to grow. So look at South Carolina there. 60% of the population was slave. And so it makes you wonder how the white population managed to keep so much control over the slave population in this area. Now, in South Carolina, their major cash crop there was rice. And so slaves in South Carolina had a little bit better bit of freedom than they had in other plantations that like grew tobacco or cotton or something like that. And that has to do with where the rice is grown. Rice is grown in marshes. And if you've ever been around a marsh, it comes with a variety of bugs, but the most predominant one is going to be the mosquito. And mosquitoes carry diseases. Now, back in the 1700s, they didn't really know this. All they knew that is if they go down into the marsh, they get sick. They get malaria or they get yellow fever. But they also started to notice that that only happened to the white population. The black population didn't get sick when they went down into the marshes. And so the white plantation owners are going to start making their foremen black slaves, and so you're going to have a black foreman over the rest of the slaves. That being the case, more often than not, the slaves had a little more freedom and were treated less harshly. Now, that doesn't go to say that all black foremen were benevolent. Anytime, I don't care, it makes little difference what race you are, what money status you have. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so you're always going to have instances of somebody gaining power over others and it goes to their head. And it's going to happen the same thing in some of these black foremen. They're going to not be nice to their fellow slaves. Same thing happens today. You're going to have someone who is promoted to a higher position, and they're going to start being real bossy and harsh to their employees that are under them. But for the most part, on the rice plantations, the slaves are going to have a little bit more freedom. They're going to have a more of a task-oriented labor system, to where once the task was finished, then they could go about the rest of their day and not have they didn't have anything else they had to get done. Another slave colony in the South is the last of the colonies to be developed by England, and that's going to be Georgia. Georgia was originally set up as a penal colony, so it's a prison colony. Its governor was James Oglethorpe, and this is where England is going to send a lot of their petty criminals. In England, you have got a very small island, and their crime rate has gone up to where their prisons are packed, and so they're starting to use ships called prison ships to keep prisoners on. These prison ships are horrible. They're nasty. They breed disease. The wardens on these ships are cruel, and the overcrowding is deplorable. And so they're looking for ways to spread out this prison population. So they're going to do two things. So they're going to found Georgia over in the New World, and it's about the same time that they also take control of what is now Australia, and Australia will also be a penal colony. If you've ever seen the continent of Australia, you know that most of the cities are around the edges, and the inside is the outback, and it's almost unlivable. And so it made it very easy for them to just go take these criminals over there and just dump them off, and where were they going to go? So what they're going to do is they're going to send their hardened criminals, their murderers, rapists, crimes against the state, their really bad guys are going to go to Australia, and their petty criminals are going to come over to the New World and be sentenced to Georgia. So things for pickpocketing, shoplifting, jaywalking, just petty crimes. You got sideways with you were serving, got sideways with your master, and they didn't like it, and they'll send you off to the New World as punishment. And so Georgia is going to be set up, and Georgia is going to be used as a buffer zone, an additional buffer zone between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida. Florida is going to be the property of Spain all the way up until the middle 1810s. About 1812, 1815, 1816 is when the Adams-Onis Treaty is going to be negotiated, and we finally get control of Florida. And so they're trying to give this buffer zone between the two areas. Now, slaves are not always going to docilely sit back and take all this. There are going to be slave uprisings. The most well-known one during this time period is going to be the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion happens on a rice plantation about 20 miles west of Charleston. And the slaves are going to rise up and try to escape across Georgia into Spanish Florida. Many years ago, I guess, about 8 years ago, my son, who used to be in the Navy, he ran a nuclear reactor on a submarine, and he also taught at the Nuclear Power School in Charleston. And so me, being the history nerd that I am, decided to go out there because Charleston has got colonial history and Revolutionary War and Civil War. It's got all this history, so it's a great place to go for a history nerd like me. And so I would go out there, and while he was at work during the day, I would go look at all these historical sites. Well, I decided I wanted to go out and look at where the Stono Rebellion happened. And so I drove out there, I parked my car, didn't think anything about being in a marsh. I grabbed my camera, I go out to where the path led so that I could see the plantation on the other side of the swamp, and I was going to get pictures of where all this uprising happened. Oh my heavenly days. They have got mosquitoes out there as big as you guys. They're huge and they're everywhere. So I got out there, I took my pictures as fast as I could and ran back to the information building because they were about ready to carry me off. But once I got into the information building, I started, talking to the park ranger there about the different things about the Stoner Rebellion, and he told me something that I had no idea about before. When you think of a slave uprising, you think that all the slaves on the plantation rose up against the master and tried to get away. That wasn't the case. You have the ones that are rebelling, who are fighting against the slaves that are protecting the master. And I thought that was very peculiar. But the park ranger said, well, think about this. You have this area that is a wilderness and it's swamp. And it's not, you don't have Interstate 95 running up and down there and civilization that can get you from point A to point B. And so the slaves that are protecting their master are also protecting their way of life. Even though it's a slave way of life, they at least know where they're going to sleep that night. They know they're going to get at least somewhat fed and have clothes on their back. If they rebel, then they're going off into the swamp, and while they may have a cellular structure that protects them from malaria, they don't have one that protects them from starvation or from alligators. And so I thought that was quite interesting that one set of slaves was fighting against the other set of slaves in the Stoner Rebellion. Of course, the Stoner Rebellion gets put down. Later on, we'll talk about other rebellions that take place. But the slaves are not going to just sit back and say, okay, I'm going to be a slave and I'm going to be happy about this. And so slavery is going to really take off in the southern part of the colonies. Now, as I've talked about before, with all of these colonists, most of them are from Great Britain. And so they have grown accustomed to enjoying the rights and liberties as Englishmen that they had back at home, as far as, the right to a jury trial, the right to limited government, that no one is above the law. That all comes out of the Magna Carta of 1215. So the language of liberty is already well known by the English settlers as they're over here, and they're going to start incorporating that into their systems of government over here. They're going to allow more people the right to vote. Over in England, most men did not have the right to vote. Only landed gentry had the right to vote. Well, over here, more and more people, men, are going to be allowed to vote. In fact, as time goes on, they're even going to take away the qualification that you had to be a church member or you had to own property to be able to vote in general assemblies of most colonies. And they also believed in republicanism, the idea that you can elect a representative that is going to represent the interest of everybody and not just the elite. And so that's going to start off very early over here and become part of the fabric of American democracy as we get closer to becoming an independent country. A lot of the ideas that we have are going to come from philosophers like John Locke, Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes, and as we get into the creation of our founding documents, I'll go more in depth into those. The right to vote is also known as suffrage. So I don't care if we're talking about man suffrage right now, women's suffrage later, black suffrage, 18-year-old suffrage. Anytime that I'm talking about suffrage, I'm talking about the right to vote. And the colonies are going to create their local governments. They're going to have the House of Burgesses. You're going to have other ones in each colony. They're going to have their own local assemblies that are going to establish taxes. They're going to establish rules of law, and they're going to grow independently of England. Now, earlier on, I told you about mercantilism and how England was controlling the colonial trade by using mercantilism. But they also use something else called salutary neglect. And salutary neglect is where they're not really going to enforce the Navigation Acts. And so they're going to allow the colonies to become really, really, really independent. And they're going to get used to doing their own thing because Mother England is not paying close attention to them right now. You're also going to have the rise of the colonial press. One of the forerunners in that's going to be Benjamin Franklin. And so you're going to have more and more printed material coming out so that people in the colonies keep themselves pretty much well informed. As time goes on, the royal governors over here, the representatives of England over here, are going to take notice. There's going to be this really famous trial called the Trial of John Peter Zenger, Zenger. And this man is a newspaper publisher, and he starts criticizing the royal governor and Parliament in England in his newspaper. Well, he's going to be accused of seditious libel. Now, sedition is when you try to overthrow the government, and libel is when you do that in print. And so out of his efforts and in this trial, which he finally gets acquitted of, we're going to come up with our First Amendment right to freedom of the press. But the idea of the American Enlightenment is going to take hold over here much the same way it does over in Europe. You're going to have the scientific method applied to society. You're also going to have a belief in deism. Deism is the belief that you have a supreme being that came and created everything, but then walked away from it. It does not have any kind of personal interaction with what it created. So people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin are going to be deists, and so deism kind of dovetails very well with the Enlightenment ideas of reason and how truth can be taken from what you see around you. Now, another aspect of colonial society right in the decades right before the Revolutionary War is going to be the Great Awakening. Now, in American history, we have got two Great Awakenings. There's the first Great Awakening that happens in the decades before the Revolutionary War, and then in the 19th century, then there is the Second Great Awakening that's going to happen in the decades before the Civil War. So with the First Great Awakening, it is a series of religious revivals that are going to take place all up and down the colonies. And you're going to have itinerant preachers that are going to go from town to town and hold these tent meetings. They are not preachers that have a congregation and a base church. They just go from place to place. In this country, you're going to have two main preachers, because the Great Awakening is going to happen everywhere. Jonathan Edwards, and here, let me give you a picture of him. So this is Jonathan Edwards. He is going to write a pamphlet called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Basically, Jesus is coming and boy is he angry. And then you're also going to have George Whitefield, who starts his preaching over in England and then is going to come over here. So it's kind of a transatlantic type of revival. And so they're going to go from place to place, and they're going to preach what's known as Jeremiad sermons. That's Jeremiad. And it's based off the book of Jeremiah, if you've ever read that out of the Bible. And in Jeremiah, this prophet is berating the Israelites that if they don't come back to God, God's going to annihilate them. Well, in these Jeremiah sermons, it's basically come to the foot of the cross or you're going to burn in hell. And it was basically trying to scare people into heaven. But in the process of this, people are going to start looking at what they believe in relationship to what they were doing and trying to get the two to mesh together better. You're going to have the old lights, which are traditionalists, traditionalist, and you're going to have the New Lights, which want to see change happen. The New Lights are going to criticize colonial taxes. They are also going to promote religious freedom. But one of the biggest things that's going to come out of the first Great Awakening is going to be the distribution of printed material across all of the colonies, and it's going to get more and more people informed. So by the time we get to the years before the Revolution, someone like Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense, can easily get his information distributed across all the 13 colonies. By the time we get into the mid-1700s, the New World has pretty much been overtaken by countries in Europe. You're going to have the English along the seaboard. You're going to have the French up in the center and up in Canada. You're going to have the Spanish in southern part of what is now the United States, all the way down into South America. But you're also going to have another smaller little group. I'm going to get this map up here for you so you can see it. Over here on this side over here, right up here, and you're going to have the Russians coming in as well. So because they can come down through Alaska and over that way. And so by the time we get to the mid-1700s, you got this little area right over here that is being claimed by more than one area. Spain wants it, Great Britain wants it, France wants it. Later on, the United States is going to be involved in it. And so that what becomes later known as the Oregon Territory is going to have a lot of different groups that are going to want it at one time. The Spanish, as they start to spread into California, are going to start setting up missions. And an interesting thing about the way they set their missions up, each mission, and you can still see them spaced out, they are spaced out this way as they are a day's walk in between. So they're kind of like sanctuaries for people, for travelers, as well as missions to be able to convert the native population. The French are also going to take a different viewpoint of their North American assets, and they're going to start sending over here their criminal aspects and their social outcasts. It's kind of like you're going to be banished to the New World. And as you look at this map, you can see that the majority of it is controlled by the French and the Spanish. The battle for the continent, though, is fixing to take place. As we talked about in previous chapters, you know that the Native Americans are pretty friendly with the French. And so you have up here in this area right here, you have got, all the French running through here, and they've got their friends, the Native Americans. Well, as the English become more and more populous, so they gain more and more people, then they're going to start encroaching over here on French territory, and especially on Native American territory. Okay, and so it's going to cause conflict that is finally going to break out into what is known as the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War starts in 1754 and ends in 1763. It is between the French and the Indians on one side and the English and the American colonists on the other. Now, the English and the French have been at each other's throats for decades, for centuries. And so it's just another a battle for empire and conquest. And as the war rages on, most of it is going to be fought right here along the St. Lawrence River area and on just either side. So in these upper colonies is where it's going to be fought. This is where George Washington is going to get his early training as a general, and where he's going to have some of his major defeats and make his biggest mistakes as a general before he learns how to lead soldiers in a better fashion. And as the war rages on over here, it's going to spill over into war between France and Britain over in Europe. But it's not going to start until 2 years later. So the 7 Years' War in Europe is basically the same war as the French and Indian War over here. It just started 2 years later. And you know how they were over in Europe about, calling their wars by a certain number of years. So the 7 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. And so the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War are basically the same war. Now, in 1763, the British are going to defeat the French, and they're going to create the Treaty of Paris that is going to end this war. Now, let me give you a little heads up about the Treaty of Paris. If you're ever taking a test and one of your choices is the Treaty of Paris and you can't remember exactly what treaty it is, pick that one, because the Treaty of Paris ends a gajillion wars. I know it ends at least 3 U.S. wars that we're involved in. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Later on, there's going to be the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And then in the next century, there's going to be the Treaty of Paris of 1898. So the Treaty of Paris is always your best shot if you can't remember exactly which treaty it was that ended a war. And so with the Treaty of Paris, then you're going to have the French totally kicked off of North America. So all this area right up there, all the way down to here, all that is given over to either Spain or to Great Britain. So let me show you the next map. So with the Treaty of Paris, all this over here on the western side of the Mississippi River, south of Canada, is going to Spain. And then everything else, Canada and everything east of the Mississippi River, except down here in Spanish Florida, is going to go to Great Britain. Right? And so France is totally kicked off, but that's just the government that gets kicked off. It doesn't mean that all the French people go. And to this day, Quebec and Quebec province of Canada is the only French-speaking province in Canada, and they would very much like to break away from the rest of Canada and become their own country, because they're the odd one out in a country that speaks English and has been controlled by the British Empire ever since this time period. I don't know that they're ever going to get that done, because Quebec is right there in the middle of Canada. But that's their desire. You're also going to have a lot of Frenchmen that are going to either get kicked out of the area or get moved on or feel unsafe. And so they're going to come down from these areas over here on like Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and they're going to migrate down this way and settle down here around New Orleans. And that's where you're going to get your French Quarter and a lot of your French speaking down here in New Orleans. Now, once this war is over, and we're going to talk more about this war as we get into the Revolution, but one of the big things that's going to come from this war is this line right here. See this red line on this map? That is the proclamation line of 1763. And what the British are going to do is they're going to draw this line and say, colonists, you stay on the east of it, the Indians are going to stay on the west of it, and everything will be just fine. They're trying to rebuild their relationships with the Native Americans. It's been totally destroyed because of this war. So they're trying to rebuild trade relationships with the Native Americans. They want to stop having to come over and rescue the colonists. So they keep the colonists on this side and the Native Americans on this side. They can keep conflict away and rebuild that relationship. And that's what the British goal was. But the American colonists, now you know how Americans are. We're the same way today. We're Americans and we do what we want to. And so they're going to keep going over the Appalachian Mountains into this area right here, into this Ohio River Valley area. And they're going to come into more conflict with Native Americans. This is where Pontiac's rebellion happens, right up here around Detroit. And so there's going to be a lot of conflict that's going to go on. And the British are going to push back, and that's going to be one of the stepping stones how we get into the Revolutionary War and what happens in the latter part of the 18th century. Now, that pretty much takes care of chapter 4, and I want to go back and I want to finish up what was left in your notes for period 2. I know I jumped into period 3 with some of this, but I want to kind of wrap up a little bit of your boxes in your period 2 notes. So where we left off the other day, you have boxes at the bottom of, I think it's the 4th page of the notes. It says, was migration to colonial America motivated primarily by economic, religious, or political factors? And what you want to do whenever you get a prompt like this, whether it is, a essay you have to write ahead of time, or it's an essay that shows up on a test, and whether it's one of my tests or a different professor, different subject, if they're giving you a what was the primary cause or rank in importance type of question, then what you want to do is you want to take the categories and you want to fill in what you know about each category. So what you're going to want to do with this one here is you want to list the economic reasons for coming over, the religious reasons for coming over, the political reasons for coming over, and give it, maybe a little short description so you know what you're talking about, okay? And then the column with the most stuff, that's going to be your primary factor. And then the column with the second most stuff is going to be your second most, primary factor. And then the third one from, and so forth. Now, I can tell you right now, there's not going to be, at this time, a lot of political factors. Okay? The other two are going to have more. But that way you can determine where you stand on that question by figuring out who has the most factors and why they came over. If that doesn't make sense, please use my email or Remind or even the discussion board if you like to ask me questions on how to complete that. Several of you have already reached out to me that way, and that's perfectly fine. Yes, you can work together on this stuff. Someone has asked me that question, so please do. The next page has just got the manifest of the Mayflower, who all came over on the Mayflower, and then who were in the first 3 groups of colonists in the, I'm going to make this bigger so you can see this. The colonists in Jamestown and in Virginia, and it's just a way to compare the two regions and see how it all panned out, who went where, and this kind of gives you a better visual on the family groups and the single men on this one. Now on the last page, the question is, to what extent did the English colonies develop differently from the French and Spanish colonies, and how did that development lead them to independence where the French and the Spanish didn't go there? Well, it has to do with numbers and reasons for coming over. You have the English who are coming over. Yes, they're looking for wealth and riches, but they don't find it. So they're going to send lots and lots of people. And they're going to develop differently because of that. Whereas the French, they find fur, they're not going to want to share, so they're not going to send many people. You have the Spanish that are going to find gold, they're not going to want to share, they're not going to send many people. Okay? So when you don't have many people, you don't have a whole lot you have to control, and they're going to be very loyal. They don't want to mess their gig up, and so they're not going to push against the mother country. But with the English, and with salutary neglect in that they're not enforcing the Navigation Acts, they let these Englishmen get over here and get really, really independent and set up their own thing. All right? So I hope between that I've laid enough groundwork so you can look at your differences and figure out why that led to independence, why they struck out and broke away from the mother country, which no other colonial group had ever done before, and the French and the Spanish don't. Okay? And then some of the other stuff that I talked about is in your period 3 notes. I will be delving more into that when we start talking about chapter 5 and how we get involved in the revolution and break away from the mother country. So one of the things you really need to remember at this point, in 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, the American colonists, the English colonists, are very, very happy Englishmen. They have just won a glorious victory with the help of the mother country against the French and the Indians. And so in 1763, they're very content to be connected to the mother country. And that's going to change very rapidly over the next 20 years. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. I will help you as best I can. And I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.